What's up guys, James from SIKKY. On this episode of the FRS LS build, we're gonna get into some stuff on the chassis itself, some more prep work, all little minor things, but stuff that we need to get done before we set this motor in. So last episode, we banged out a bunch of stuff on the actual engine. Still more to do on that. Not sure if we'll get into that this episode, but we're definitely gonna focus on some mods to the car, some more prep work. So let's get started. So because this car was originally had the exhaust coming back under this side, you can see now you've got fuel lines and two brake lines that come up right where the new headers are gonna come through. So we're gonna have to remove that big sheet metal bracket and this corner, this harness plastic right there. We're gonna pull all that off. This whole piece of the harness here actually goes to the factory computer. None of those wires are gonna get reused. So typically what we end up doing is just securing that back under the tunnel on top of the trans. You could go through the work of fully de-pinning these, since most of them are dead end to the ECU, and you could literally split the harness and pull them all out if you wanted to spend the time on it. The other thing we're gonna deal with is these heater core lines stick out a little bit too far, so we typically trim them back, and then we install our tight 90 hoses that we make. Makes that part of the swap super easy. So we'll move on to pulling these fuel lines out, and then we're gonna use the SIKKY fuel line kit, which makes it super easy to get this plumbed up and back to the factory fuel tank. All right, so behind the driver's seat, we're gonna access this 10 mil bolt. Take that out, allows you to pick up the back of the front of the back seat and get it up out of the way. Now we can gain access to this fuel panel here that gets you down to where the fuel tank is. All right, so now we have access to this cover. This is actually glued down with an adhesive, so you just want to really carefully kind of pry up on this thing. Try to separate the adhesive. We're trying not to bend this thing too much, so we can just put it right back down and it'll stick right back to the adhesive when we're done. It's pretty gooey stuff, so usually works well as long as you don't bend the hell out of this thing when you're taking it up, but just kind of work your way around. Give it a little tweak. And once it really starts to separate, then it gets easier. It's almost like windshield sealant, probably very similar to that, but for some reason you needed to put new sealant on this thing. I'm sure you could use the same product you would use on a windshield and it would work fine. It's gooey stuff though. So I just separate it, stick it back down where it was. All right, so now we got access to this. We're gonna knock this ring loose that's on here, unplug the line, unplug this sensor, or the power, I should say. All right, so first I'm gonna disconnect this fuel line from the top of the pump, get that out of the way, and try to get this ring loose now. Just gonna knock it counterclockwise. Once it gets loose, you can move to using your hands to spin it, but it does have an index mark too when you're tightening it back down to line it up, so you know it's properly tightened. Now it's loose enough to just spin by hand. I'm gonna keep turning it. Just, keep track of the seal. I'll leave any of that and get that off. Now we should be able to pick up on the fuel system, or the fuel hanger, I should say. And just remember, there's like a crossover tube that goes to the other side of the saddle tank, so Dump the excess fuel back in here. Try not to make a mess. Let's see, I just remember you got the fuel level float, and then right here you're going to disconnect this crossover. And then we'll take this out of the car to do the actual fuel pump installation. All right, to get access to the pump, we're going to need to separate the top and the bottom. There's a little snap ring on this side of this shaft that comes up, so we're just going to pop this off. And once you remove that, it allows this thing to separate from the bottom. Keep in mind you got some wiring that's also holding things together, so just carefully route that out from underneath the plastic hooks that are kind of securing it. Once you do that, it gives you enough room to separate this and get access to the bottom. All right, so we got that off. The fuel pump itself is down in here, which is held in by these little clips. 3 of them in total. So once you pop them out, then you can lift this whole thing out of the bottom. So just be careful, you don't have to unhook these hoses. You just want to be careful in the process where we're not kinking things or bending it and messing anything up. So same thing, you can separate all this stuff. Just kind of get it out of your way. And now we're going to unhook everything off the bottom here. Once you undo those clips, out comes the pump. And there you go, factory FRS fuel pump. All right, so the piece that was clipped onto the pump that actually holds the regulator into the bottom of this housing, we're only going to reuse part of it. We don't reuse the part that holds the fuel pump in. It doesn't actually fit on the DoucheWorks pump. It would be nice, it's actually real close if it did pop in there, but I think just the size, it's a little bit longer, but either way, I'm going to run the bigger, higher flow pump. Comes in the box. We got a new harness. We're not going to reuse this little sleeve either that was in the factory one. So in the DoucheWorks box, there are going to be 3 O-rings. There should be one still down in the port where your fuel pump came out. If not, it might be stuck on here, but either way, this 300C pump uses all 4 of these O-rings. Of course, we got a new sock that's going to go on the bottom, and then some lube to kind of grease up those O-rings and make sure they slide in easily into the housing. So I'll set this stuff aside. So yeah, first step, we get these O-rings installed over the outlet of the pump. And you can just kind of push them down. They're going to get smashed up in there once you get going. Put a little bit of lube on here. In this case, the other O-ring is in there, so I'm going to remove it just so we can make sure it goes on nicely with the other ones. Doesn't bind up or anything. Just take some of that. This grease will just dissolve in the fuel like instantly, so you don't have to worry about it getting on anything, but just makes it go up in the housing a little bit easier. All right, so you're not gonna be able to see in there, but if you look up in there, there's a hole. You're gonna drop this down in and then begin to slide it in. So one thing to note, you kind of have to pull over on the pump to get the plug to come through this. to get it all the way seated, it'll kind of look like it's installed, but then if you lean it and push, it'll pop past. So that the plug is actually coming all the way up into this little cutout instead of being underneath of it. So that's how you know it's kind of seated, and you can use a little persuasion on the table. Make sure you take the harness. This side goes to the pump, the gray one goes back to the factory side. And then we're gonna press the sock on. Make sure that gets up in there good. Just wanna make sure we got a good seal so it's drawing the fuel through the sock and not around it. All right, so before we drop the pump into the bottom of the housing, we're gonna need to separate this piece that holds the regulator up into this housing. We're not gonna be reusing this because it doesn't fit. So a number of different ways you can do it. You know, a saw, you can score it with a razor blade. Just wanna try to keep it intact to the point where it'll do its job. It's not super crucial that it looks pretty or is done any certain way, but I should just score it like this, and you can give it a little bit of a twist. Simple as that, just snaps off, and then this is what secures the regulator back in here so it can't drop out. So at that point, we've got everything ready to go back into the bottom of the housing here. This ring I took off in a previous step. It doesn't actually need to be taken off initially, but once you get that back on this thing, you're just gonna drop it back in, make sure everything looks good and lined up. Don't wanna pinch any wires or anything like that. Make sure this fully clips in. So it does apply some pressure up to the bottom of the pump too, just kind of helps ensure that it doesn't go anywhere. All right, so you're gonna rotate this a little bit. Get the wires out of the way for the moment. We're gonna slide these two posts back down in, and at the same time, I'm gonna guide this excess fuel hose down into this little compartment on the side here. You kind of got to manipulate these rods a little bit, but they'll go in. So once you get that in, don't forget you got to put your clip back on. And that just makes sure that it doesn't fully pop out. Everything looks good, so we're going to move on to plugging everything in. So it's the reverse of what you did when you took it off. Obviously the new wires on this pump are a little bit beefier. We're going to route these through the factory clips and plug in. And we're going to do the same with the fuel level sensor sender wires and plug them in. So all that looks good. And when it's installed in the car, everything does kind of press down in. So you want to make sure if you fully compress this that nothing's doing anything weird, rubbing on something we don't want it to rub on, and you know, just make sure everything looks secure and neatly routed. When it's fully compact, nothing's touching or doing anything bad, so I think we're good to go. All right, so that is pretty much it in a nutshell. Now we're ready to put this thing back into the car. All right, so a reverse of the process taking it out. First thing I like to do is plug in this crossover hose. And then we're gonna carefully guide the fuel level sender in, then the hose itself. All right, and then we're going to rotate it back to the same orientation. And this is where you want to make sure that everything feels normal and everything's sitting properly down in the fuel tank, because this piece actually presses this big rubber seal into the tank as you tighten that ring. So if it's not dropping all the way down in now, then you know you got an issue. So I just want to make sure it feels secure. All right, this is a super important step before you put the ring on. Just want to make sure that your seal is all the way down in, so you can kind of rotate the pump and feel around. Sometimes it'll get hung up on the edges and it won't allow it to sit tight and seal actually in the top of the tank. So be careful you get that right. And you're going to take your ring, reinstall that kind of while you're holding everything down. It has a tendency to want to pop up on you since there's a spring in there. But then we're going to, while we're holding it down, we're going to get this ring started. It's going to be a little bit difficult sometimes, but once you get started though, you're going to thread it down. Try to keep the pump housing indexed properly with the blue arrow that's pointing towards the back. Not sure if it's always blue, but it is on the ones I've done. All right, so we got that. It's going. Now we're going to tighten it down till the blue arrow lines up. This is what really kind of puts the tension on it. You can see, I don't know, the blue arrows right here starting to come around. So I got it as tight as I could with my hand, and then this last quarter turn is crucial, just to make sure we got the right seal. Almost there. There you go. Now all the lines are lined up. We know it's tight. And if you were gonna just put this back, say you were doing this on a non-LS swapped FRS, at this point you would just plug in your factory feed line and put your cap back on, and in this case, we're gonna be using the SIKKY feed line setup for the LS engine. So we're gonna move on, leave this open for now, go to the underside and pull this through so we can feed the new line up through. All right, so now we got the fuel pump in. We have the factory feed line or output line coming from the fuel pump disconnected up there still. But before we can pull all these lines out, we're gonna have to unclip these factory retainers here and start pulling these out. Then we'll be able to pull that one line down, which eventually will get replaced with the SIKKY line. So I'm gonna start popping these clips off, and we're gonna free up these lines all the way up into the engine compartment and then totally remove them. All right, so just to show you, this is what the clip looks like. So it mounts on the stud, which you can see right down here. And then this side is actually on the two brake lines that go to the rear wheels. So there's a little clip on here. Basically, it's got to pry it off the stud, and then this snaps on. So if you want to remove it, you can actually reuse these. So with the line we're going to be putting on, they're nice to keep. The ones that are in front of the cross member, like right here, won't get reused, because typically when we run this fuel line, we'll come back up along here, and then when we get to the cross member here, we're going to route it up over top of the transmission. That way it's far away from the headers when they're coming down here. But so yeah, you're going to pop them off, unclip them, and pull the lines out, and just try not to break them. They're pretty sturdy, so you just got a little persuasion with a flathead screwdriver. All right, so now they're all free. So we're going to unclip it from the brake lines and then remove these other three lines. All right, so now we can actually pull down on the line we disconnected from the factory pump and get covered in gas. But as you can see, the factory actually comes off in T's, so it's a single out from the pump, and then T's that goes up to the 2 different fuel rails. So obviously we're going to simplify that and get rid of the dual line because this is still a returnless system. But either way, we're going to pull these all the way up. So we'll move up to the part where it comes up to firewall and get that apart next. All right, next one in line is this 12 mil holding this steel bracket on. It's got the same style clip, so basically just pull this apart as well. We're not going to be reusing this one. All right, on to the next. All right, so there's 2 more 12s holding this L-shaped bracket on right here. All right, so at this point, the 3 lines are completely free. So we're gonna completely get them out of the picture. You can see, got that bracket out of the way, which was right here. Gets in a lot of ways. Certain transmissions like T56 or TR66, you actually got to dent this in a bit. As I mentioned with the CDO9, it's a smaller bell housing across the front here, so might not have to do much. I'm gonna opt to wait and just massage as much as needed to get it to fit right. You can see, still got the 2 brake lines obviously, but all those fuel lines are gone. And at this point, we're going to wait to put the fuel line in because it's gonna end up routing up and the trans cross member's right around here. So we're gonna come up, and then once that's in place, then we'll route it in above the transmission. So at this point, the fuel lines are just getting in the way, but we needed to get that out of the way to make sure it's ready for installation. All right, so next area we're gonna address, the collector and the headers come down right here between the steering column and these 2 rear brake lines. So SIKKY makes a brake line kit that allows you to relocate this and then run the brake lines with a steel braided line instead of this rigid line from here up to the input and output of the ABS pump. So we're gonna unbolt this 12, and then we're actually gonna manipulate the factory lines to follow right underneath here, and then you can use a self-tapping screw bolt to fasten it to here out of the way. I like to put it on the other side, that way it's totally out of the way of the headers. You're not heating the brake fluid, and it's safe over here. And then from here, we'll route the line up along the subframe and come out up by the ABS. But again, that step of installing the line is going to be saved till after the engine's in. There's no point doing it now, but it does make it a lot easier to manipulate and relocate this now before we put the engine and trans in. So we're going to go ahead and knock that out next. So first step is we got to unbolt or unscrew the brake lines that are going forward. So you take a line wrench. It's pretty tough to do this with a regular wrench and not strip out these fittings. So if you don't have one, it's a good tool to add to your tool lineup because these are always super tight. And you can see I'm literally bending the mounting bracket in the process of cracking it loose. So doesn't matter in this case since we're not reusing that bracket, but either way, you can see they're real tight in there. And so now we're gonna turn this the rest of the way out. Probably gonna make a little bit of mess with some brake fluid here since this line is just gonna drain out from the ABS pump, but move on to a regular opening wrench just to make it quicker. Might make it easier if I pop them out of those clips up there. It's clearly putting a little tension on the line, making this fitting hard to back out. Nope, still tight. Luckily we're not reusing this because I got a feeling this thing would not be fun to put back in. Hopefully the hole in this block is still good, since we will be reusing the little distribution block. All right, both lines are free. We're gonna bend them out of the way for the moment and move on to removing this 12 here and the 12 out of this bracket, and then we're gonna hand bend these lines to fit. All right, so I like to put one of the plastic clips back in just to kind of help guide you with where you can start bending, and I'll typically get to up about here and then twist and bend and utilize these two bends to kind of move things where I want. But they're coated in this real nice thick plastic coating, so you're not really gonna hurt anything. I wouldn't worry about manhandling them a little bit. I mean, obviously you don't want to bend them to the point where you're kinking them, but I mean, it's kind of common sense. But just like any brake line, they're easily manipulated. They basically just start working them in the direction you want. You can even use the chassis itself to help you bend. All right, so I got everything bent where I want it. Ends up mounting right here to the bottom of this part of the subframe, or the brace for the subframe that holds the sway bar. Like I said, you can put this wherever you want, but you can see lines are way out of the way. The collectors are gonna come by here, not close. It's not rubbing on anything, and it gives me a really good access point to route the lines right up through here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put these lines all the way on while I'm at it. Might as well, then we don't have any brake fluid dripping around, and obviously we'll still need to bleed these when everything's done, but it'll just kind of finish this project up. So I'm gonna continue on, put the lines together now. All right, so we're gonna thread these fittings into the block. These fittings come with the SIKKY lines, just to make sure I got my clearance right and everything looks good. And when I have it where I want it, I'm gonna mark where I want my hole. That's actually gonna hold this little bracket down. Let me get that out of the way. You can see now, well, you might not be able to see, but there's a mark right there. So you can actually drill this out and put a bolt and a nut and everything, and if you wanna get super clean with it, which I think I'm gonna do. What you get with the brake line kit, basically 2 lines, 4 fittings, and there's 90s on either side. So everything you need to basically hook these brake lines up and do this reroute. All right, that should do. All right, so we got this block mounted in place here. Just a note, if you're gonna opt to put the fittings in after you mount it, which does make it easier to thread them in here, I would put a washer under here to space this away enough so the thread on the outside of the fitting doesn't hit the piece of the subframe as you thread it in. So I'm gonna get these both threaded in, then tighten them down. Now these are reverse flares, so there's no sealant needed on these threads. The bottom of the hole, there's a reverse flare, and this fitting will seat on that and seal itself, metal on metal, kind of like an AN fitting. All right, so now we just need to tighten them down. All right, 14 mil wrench will fit these fittings. You're gonna get them tight, and usually go about a 1/4 turn. Don't need to really muscle the crap out of these. There you go. Now we're ready to get the lines on. All right, now that we got that hooked up, I'm going to feed the line through. Get it started before I get the other one hooked up before I tighten them down. Again, you can put these anywhere you want. This is just like a clean location I like to put them. But this is totally personal preference. All right, once you get them started, then you can just tighten them up. Just want to make sure when you get to the point where you're snugging it up for good, the metal line itself is not contacting the subframe anywhere. I mean, it's a tight fit in here, but like I said, it creates a really clean install. And now we can finish routing them up to where we want to hook them up on the ABS pump. All right, so next step, we got to finish removing these factory lines. So this ABS pump's labeled, it's pretty clear. And the way these lines route from the back, the line on the left is for the left wheel, as long as you don't mess up the orientation. But either way, you could follow it back to the wheel. Worst case, if you forget. But very important that you hook it up to the right port here. They're all labeled. So we've got rear right is this front one right here, and then rear left is the back one. The two middle ones are for the front wheels, so we're not going to be messing with them. But yeah, basically just going to pull these guys off and then get these factory lines the rest of the way out of the way. So that one's loose. Pop it out of the factory retaining clip and then get it out of the way. Move on to this back one. Same thing, pull it up out of there. So a little bit more difficult to get out, but just where it's located on this front clip. You kind of got to fish it through here. Again, we're not reusing it, so you can kind of bend it, to manipulate it to how you need to fish it out of here. There we go. Now we're going to take the two fittings that are supplied with the SIKKY kit. There's 4 of these, 2 that go down on the distribution block, 2 that go up here in the ABS pump. We're going to tighten these up. Again, these are 14 mil wrench. Same thing, get them tight, and then you're going to go for about a 1/4 turn usually. And that seats it in there nicely. Obviously the coned or pointy end goes up. That's what accepts the AN, the -3 fitting. And I set my lines up here to know that the one that's on the left side is the one I want to hook to the left. So we're gonna route these conveniently. Again, complete freedom in how you route it. I mean, there's a million ways to do this, so don't feel like you got to do it the way I'm doing it. And we'll tighten that up with the 13 mil wrench. All right, and that wraps up the brake line install. I would go along and secure this with a zip tie, try to isolate it from rubbing on anything metal. These are steel braided with a nylon liner, so they're pretty durable, but you know, 10 years of it vibrating and rubbing on a sharp piece of metal could result in it springing a leak, and you obviously want to keep it away from anything hot or anywhere it's going to get pinched. All common sense, but worth noting. But yeah, so obviously you're going to want to bleed the system out just like you would with any brake system at this point. I'm not going to cover that because it's a standard procedure, but at the end of the swap, it wouldn't hurt to just bleed your brakes out normally, front or rear wheels and front wheels, like your normal process. So yeah, moving on to the next step. All right, so another step I want to knock out real quick is going to be adding in the spacers that go between the front subframe and the chassis itself. The original kit had an aluminum spacer, basically like a thick washer that went in between the two. The most recent kits run a sheet metal version. It looks like this, 1/4 inch thick, gives you the proper clearance between the steering column, the headers, and just overall less clearancing you have to do on the tunnel. So it just makes the install work better. It doesn't have any ill effects to the car itself. But we're gonna knock that out real quick. Basically, you're just gonna take the subframe bolts out that hold the subframe in. You can leave these front 2 in that hold it to this brace, but we're gonna knock the back 2 out and the side, and then we do the same on the other side, and the whole subframe will just kind of hang from the sway bar end links. We slip these in, put the hardware back in, and tighten it back up. So let's knock that out next. Good and tight. And we're just gonna do the same on the other side. Keep in mind these back two that go in the chassis are different lengths because the one part here is real thin, so the shorter one goes on that thin side. All right, so now you can see it's hanging. Actually, in this case, I forgot to take off this little plastic piece on the outside over here, which is actually holding the subframe on, but you could technically slip the brackets in right now and put it right back up, but I gotta take that plastic piece off anyway, so get that out of the way and then we'll install the new brackets. All right, so this is the little triangle-ish plastic piece that goes on either side here. Now you can see I pulled that one out and I can get my fingers up in there. It's just hanging from the end links, which are hooked to the shock, so it's not going anywhere. It makes it real easy. So now we're gonna take these brackets and reverse the process we just did. So the main front two brackets, they're the same bracket. Basically what determines what goes on left or right is which way you orient it. But this edge right here that comes down at an angle follows the inside edge of the subframe, or the frame rail I should say. And then this rounded piece actually lines up with the way the subframe up here is rounded. So this side goes in just like this. And you just kind of set it there, and that edge follows the frame rail itself. And then you're gonna hand tighten the bolt up in there, get it started. Make sure you're lined up. You might have to wiggle it around if your holes aren't going where they're supposed to. All right, so that bolt now goes through the bracket and into the frame rail. And we'll do the same on the back one here. Pretty easy. Just had to move it slightly to allow it to pop in there. All right, so they're finger tight. Now we can move to the rear one on this side. Same thing. It basically follows the profile. So you got this rounded side over here, which corresponds to the rounded side. Same for the other side. You literally just flip it like that. So real easy to get in here, not too hard to figure out. And your bolt hole should line right up. Short bolt goes on the thin side. At this point, you might actually have to lift up on the subframe. Must not have had that bolt threaded in all the way. Just push up on it lightly. They're going through the sheet metal and then into the frame rail itself. Just get a couple threads going, make sure you're threading right. Put this bolt back where it goes. There we go. I'm just gonna snug these up a little bit, not actually pull the subframe up, but just get them till they're going back up in here. All right, and we'll move to the other side. I'll show you more of a close-up. All right, to reiterate, now that you can see up close, we've got this long straight edge, which actually runs the length of this frame rail. It lines right up with that. And then this rounded edge follows the rounded edge of this profile where the bolt goes through. So it's basically gonna slide right in like that. And we're gonna put the hardware back in. You can cut the majority of this fiddling around out. All right, so once it goes through, then you can feel the threads again. Just get it started. Make sure it's actually started this time. Then we'll move on to the back one. All right, so now that they're finger tightened, snug them up a little bit. And I'm gonna pull up a little on the subframe now just to make it easier to get the back ones in. Just make sure you're not pinching anything. All right, and I'll do a close-up of the rear ones. All right, same deal. Round corner, squared corner. Slide it in like that, line up the bolt holes. Slip the hardware in. Longer bolt goes on this side. Through the plate, into the subframe, or into the frame rail. Just get it started, same thing. Now we can start bringing these up. I could get them all kind of a little bit snug before I crank them down, just to allow the subframe to settle in where it wants to be. We'll move up to the big ones on the front side here. Now I'm just gonna go all the way around and tighten everything up. Just check these back ones one more time, make sure they're all the way tight. That'll do it. All right, so that's gonna wrap up this episode. Got a lot of progress done. I'm happy with what we finished so far. A couple more things to get done on the car and the engine, and then we can start setting this thing in, which I'm really looking forward to that. So make sure you guys subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll see you on the next one.